take a look at variable names in Visual Basic. I'll talk about some different conventions too. Let me double click. I got form 1 here and I got a button 1. I'll double click that. And when you're declaring variables, you do a dim and then you give it a variable name. And let's say I want to S for sales. This is a perfectly legitimate name, S, but it's not very descriptive. It's much better if you type out sales. Now I know exactly what this represents. Do not typically use one letters for your variable names. There are some cases where it does make sense. If you're trying to program, for example, a quadratic formula, A, B, and C actually make sense. Try to be descriptive. Don't get too long. Don't say sales for year 2000 during the administration of Marconi as double. It's legitimate, but who wants to write an entire sentence? So you have to find a balance when you're doing your variable names. You definitely don't want one letter. You definitely don't want a whole sentence. Sometimes you'll use variable names that are actually reserved words. Like, for example, if I do dim double as double. Well, double's a word you cannot use. It's a reserved word. It's a keyword. So you can't use that. And that'll tell you if you're doing that. If I want to start with a number, start 3 sales. Typically, in most program languages, you cannot start your variable names with numbers. If I want to have spaces in there, sales for March. Well, that's valid in Microsoft Word. You can have spaces. You cannot have spaces. If you want to have a gap there, you put underscores. That's how you handle that. The book will give you a whole slew of guidelines to help you figure out what should you name it, what can you do, what can't you do. I couldn't even tell you all the different criteria for it. I try to keep it pretty straightforward. I try to use alphanumeric letters. Don't start with a number, and use underscores. Much more readable. Sales for March versus doing sales for March. Seems like everybody has their own convention for it. They'll tell you, okay, first letter has to be uppercase, and then this would be uppercase, and then this would be uppercase. Definitely that's more readable with those uppercases there. Of course, I already got it declared. So let me put a 1 here. Definitely it's more readable, but you can see it's still, I think, better with the underscores there. You can still do your uppercase letters and so forth. So when you're talking about your names you use for your variable, those are some guidelines. Now, some other guidelines I want to give you. If I'm programming using these controls, like let me drop on a text box. I'll drop on 2 text boxes. If I have this one, click this one time, don't double click it. You see over here, it gives you the name text box 1. Well, that's not a very user-friendly name. Now let's say that represented sales. If I scroll clear to the top here, you see I have one that says name. Now if yours isn't up at the top, it could be that it's not alphabetical. If I have it by categories, if I have this button clicked, then it'll be in a different location. So just click the A to Z button, scroll clear to the top, and that's where you see the name. I've developed my own convention for telling what these are. I don't want it to say text box 1. I want to say TB for text box, and then underscore, and then sales. And that way in my programming, I know that TB represents a text box versus some of these other items. Maybe this one is tax. So I go over, I click this one time, I click on under the name, I'll call it TB tax. If you want to name a button instead of button 1, you could name it BTN sales tax calculation. Now I don't do this to be picky in my programming. I do it to make my life easier. So when I'm over here and I'm starting to type some code, when I say TB underscore, then it comes up in sales and tax, and I don't have to remember which one's which. I know that sales is dealing with sales. I know that tax is dealing with tax. So that's why it's, besides just naming your variables correctly, right here, you also want to name your controls correctly that you drop on there. Now, if you're never going to use a control like button, I probably didn't need to name it that, but then again, that tells me what that button does. That button calculates the sales tax. If you go to work at a place, they'll probably give you some kind of policy that they follow. Some cases may just be guidelines of how they want you to name their variables. They do that not to be Big Brother and to watch every move you're making. They do that so that your program is easy to debug later on. When somebody comes 5 years down the road and they're trying to figure out what in the world you're dealing with, they don't have to figure out what S represents. They can see that S is your, or the variable is actually sales for March. There's one case where individual wrote a program, and I looked at it, and they used all one letter for their variables. S, A, B. I could not figure out for the life of me what it was doing. I rewrote it. Bad programming practice. Instead of me spending just maybe an hour to fix a problem, I had to spend 2 days rewriting that program. Just because I could not figure out with they call it, some of the other coding they did were using go-tos and so forth. And that I think that's still in Visual Basic, but it's very discouraged. It's called spaghetti code, where you have your code that just look like a pile of spaghetti that's dropped on there. You can't tell what variable's what. You can't tell where it's at in the program or anything. Very poor programming. So again, use good programming guidelines when you're using with your variables. I used to use the a lot. My old manager, she would still make fun of me to this day that I put the before different variables. Why did I do that? Well, I knew that no keyword ever started with the. And this was before the days where it gives you a little red squiggly underneath telling you there's something's wrong. I remember one problem I worked at, it must took me 3 days to figure out that I had used a keyword. So I started getting the habit of putting a the in front of it. And that's not good programming practice. Don't do what I did there. Nowadays you don't have to, because it again alerts you to that issue.